Oh, I'm so sorry. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on an introduction to the Campus Climate Survey. My name is Nastia Gardelova, and I am one of the training and technical assistance providers with the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault. So this webinar is presented by a team of technical assistance providers, which consists of the New York City Alliance with our partners, the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault on NISCASA, and with the New York State Department of Health. So we're really grateful for everybody's work and effort on this webinar to bring it to you today. So as a Technical Assistance Center, we help rape crisis programs from all across New York State, including with their Enough is Enough work with colleges and universities. And this webinar has really come out of a need we saw a lot in an extensive needs assessment that we did, and with folks asking really what a campus climate survey could look like, and as a rape crisis program or as an advocate, what your role can look like in supporting campus partners who are working on this. So we are very, very excited to have Kelly Adams with us today. Kelly has an MPH and is the Assistant Director of Violence Prevention and Response at MIT. Kelly is also an advocate there and was heavily involved in creating a nationally recognized MIT survey on community attitudes on sexual assault in 2014, and she's actually currently working on revising it for 2017. So we're really excited to have the opportunity to hear from Kelly and learn from her expertise today. If folks have any questions, you can go ahead and use the chat function, and we'll be leaving some time for questions at the end. And additionally, I have muted you all, but we can, depending on time, perhaps unmute if folks want to do questions over the audio line when we get to the end. But feel free to send questions throughout, and we will save them then. Additionally, Kelly might mention a couple of PDFs or documents. She has shared them with me, and I'll be sending them out to folks at the end of the webinar, so you'll be able to see them and receive them alongside the webinar recording when it's over. So thank you so much. Kelly, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Nastia. Thanks for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I think we're all set.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm just going to dive right in then. So my name is Kelly Adams. As Nastia said, I'm the Assistant Director for Violence Prevention and Response at MIT. I'm also one of the advocates there. And I'm really excited to talk to you all about campus climate surveys today, and especially to talk about the important role that advocates can play in these processes. So here's a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics when it comes to climate surveys. I'm going to be talking about the role of advocates in the climate survey processes, whether that's development of a tool or interpretation of data or what have you. I'm also going to talk about MIT's process and some of the challenges and lessons learned. I'm going to cover those documents that Nastia mentioned, the 2 planning tools I created to help other campuses who are working on climate surveys. And then just very briefly at the end, I'm going to touch on logic models and theories of change just as tools to help you out in your work. Quick note on language. The scope of campus climate surveys can include dating violence, harassment, stalking, etc., but I'm going to be using the term sexual violence or sexual assault throughout this webinar to refer to all of those topics together. So diving into some basic stuff about climate surveys. So why surveys? We have lots of sources of information on sexual violence on our campuses, and these include things like Clery statistics and reports to the institution or to Title IX. Also the cases and clients that advocacy services see. But as I'm sure you all know, there are barriers to each of these places, and we know that there's a proportion of survivors or people affected by sexual violence who never make it to any of these points. So that's why a survey can be really helpful. Additionally, campus climate surveys can help us because often we think about, or some people think about sexual violence as an issue that's sort of out there, and yes, we know it happens nationally, yes, we know it exists in the literature, but doing a survey on campus can really bring it into concrete terms and make it real for people. So that's why surveys are extremely helpful. So the climate in climate survey is really important, because if you can imagine us doing a survey on campus and just collecting information about victimization or victimization rates, we might get that information and say, oh, it's interesting, it's a little higher than the national average, it's a little lower than the national average, but it wouldn't really help us develop a plan to address these particular issues on campus. We might have questions like, where do we go from here? What would our plan be to, in fact, address these issues? So, in order to get away from the trap of just focusing on victimization, I want to introduce a model, the social ecological model. I also want to apologize. I think between me and Nastia, the font size in my presentation got made a little bigger, so it looks a little weird on the slide, so I apologize for that. But this is the social ecological model. Some of you may have seen this before. It's commonly used in fields like public health and social work and things like that. My background's in public health, so that's where I know it from. But essentially, this model says that individuals don't exist in a vacuum, and neither does behavior. So we know that individuals exist within relationships, and these relationships exist within community settings, and these community settings exist within societal settings. And we know from the research that there are risk and protective factors at each level of this model. So at the individual level, we can think about things like one's personal history and circumstances. At the relationship level, we can think about how relationships influence behavior and beliefs. At the community level, it's more about settings in which these relationships occur. And at the societal level, we can think about broad political, health, economic, and social policies, as well as things like social norms. So keeping that model in mind, this is just an example of an array of topics that might be included in a climate survey. So there's sexual violence, there's that, starting on the left, there's an individual's history and experiences, as well as how they think of their experiences. But we might also want to know about things like gender, sexual, and other forms of harassment that often occur alongside sexual violence. We might be interested in power dynamics and structures, as well as social norms around gender, violence, aggression, sexual entitlement, or a number of other things that are related to sexual violence. And we might be interested in how our institutions, laws, and policies affect survivors. So we know that the Enough is Enough legislation exists. It also has some specific requirements for what goes into a campus climate survey, including a general awareness and knowledge of all these things listed here. So including how and where to report, bystander attitudes and behavior, the difference between policies and law, and so on. And this is a comprehensive list, but I introduced the social ecological model to you so that you can use it to think about this list and enhance what is here if you're so inclined to do so. So remember that in thinking about what should be in a campus climate survey, we have to remember that surveys capture a snapshot of information at one point in time. And the ultimate goal is to do them over time to be able to measure change or identify where change is happening over time. So this is why they can be a really helpful tool for identifying areas of improvement and documenting that improvement in those areas. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that there's a concern that survivors have a negative experience with a certain service on campus, and because of that, the college or whoever's working on the survey is nervous about collecting information on that service or on that phenomenon because it might make the school or the service itself look bad. If we remember that the purpose of these surveys is to document change over time, it actually makes more sense to collect this information, because if it initially looks bad, it'll identify an area that needs improvement, and maybe the evidence needed to justify using resources to attend to that area, and it'll be easier to show improvement on future surveys. So thinking about, wow, I'm so sorry about how this slide turned out. In my own PowerPoint, I had all kinds of animations, so it didn't look as overwhelming as it does right now, but I'll try and walk you through this slowly. I'm sorry about that. So this slide is intended to help us think about maximizing the utility of campus climate surveys. So Nastia, are you there? I want to see if, I don't know if people can see my cursor.
I'm here, yep.
You can see my cursor?
No, we can't see the cursor.
Okay. Let me figure out, what about now?
There we go, that's perfect.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, and also apologies, I did check the slides earlier, but I think with the uploading, something got a little wonky.
Yeah, no problem. We'll get through it. Thanks, Nastia. So if we look at this, this is sort of where we are right now. And here's a line to where we eventually want to be. And so let's say our ultimate goal is ending sexual violence. We can think about how to get here. And thinking about how to get here is really helpful when we think about logic models and theories of change. And those are two things I will touch on very briefly at the end of this webinar. But in the meantime, we know that we have a long way to go between where we are right now and ending sexual violence. And we probably have goals that are more intermediate goals before we get to ending sexual violence. And those might be things like figuring out what the climate is like on campus. It might be constantly improving services for survivors, or something like reviewing or refining institutional processes to sort of make sure that they are the best that they can be, that they're the most efficient versions of themselves that they can be, that they're survivor-friendly, etc. So thinking about these goals and how we can use a climate survey to gather information about them, in terms of climate, we might use the survey to get at personal attitudes and beliefs and perceived norms. So to figure out what people really think about things like rape myths or attitudes towards domestic violence, different things like that. If we're interested in improving services for survivors, we can think about what to put on the survey so that we know about what the experiences are that survivors are having in terms of accessing services. We might also want to know what kinds of responses they're receiving from different offices, from different supporters in their lives, in order to see if we can improve these over time. As far as this one goes, we might want to ask about knowledge of policies or options, or reasons for reporting, so we can figure out how these processes are working for actual survivors. So going down to this corner, climate surveys are also a great place to test assumptions and answer questions. So I have a few examples in these light blue boxes. So if we assume that our community of students knows how to intervene when they see a problematic situation, we can measure that. We can test that assumption using a portion of the climate survey that asks about bystander components, whether that's willingness to intervene, confidence in one's own bystander intervention skills, or if they've actually used bystander intervention skills in the past. Another example might be the assumption that reporting is actually hindered by lack of knowledge or options or policies. So people aren't reporting because they don't know how. We could figure that out over here when we ask about knowledge of these things and reasons for reporting or not reporting. The last example I'll give is one that was popular on our campus. So people assume that sexual violence is mostly happening either at fraternities or is committed by people associated with fraternities. So we can easily test that assumption by including items that look at the location of various victimizations and or asking about the affiliation with perpetrators. Okay. So switching gears a little bit, I've talked about climate surveys at a pretty broad level and generally what could go into them. So now I want to talk about specifically the role of advocates in survey processes and what they can bring to the table. And I want you to know that advocates have a really important role to play, and especially advocates who are not on campus. I'm going to talk more about that. So first, it's really important to identify stakeholders on campus and think about their perspectives and their goals or priorities. So I've included an array of stakeholder groups here just as examples. So thinking about their perspectives and goals, we might think about university leadership and think about how one of their priorities might be student retention. Legal counsel might be thinking about institutional liability, and another example would be professors who are really interested in academic student success. So these are all important things to know and to think about, so that if you are advocating for a campus climate survey to be done or for a seat at the table during any part of the process, you can speak the same language as other stakeholders, or you can make connections for other stakeholders between what they're interested in and what you're interested in. They can also be incorporated into the survey or whatever is being done with the survey. So one of the examples I have on this slide is the International Student Services Office that we have here. And I know one example from my own work as an advocate on this campus was I used to always hear that, yeah, domestic violence is kind of a problem, but it's the international students. It's people from other countries who don't know any better. And so what I could do with that assumption is either figure out how to include an item in the survey that asks if survey participants are international students or not, and then determine if they are at more risk for certain forms of victimization or not. I could also ask about that belief, right? I could ask people how strongly they agree or disagree with the idea that domestic violence on campus is primarily or largely committed by international students. And it's something that if we found that it was a heavily endorsed item, we could work on changing over the years. So thinking about stakeholders and their respective perspectives and goals can be very, very helpful. So building on that point, advocates know the impacts of trauma. They know a lot of things, but they really know the impacts of trauma and how experiences of sexual violence and other forms of trauma can impact various areas of life. So what you can do as an advocate is connect these to things like academic success. So how does trauma impact academic success? In terms of survey items, this might be, okay, we're asking students for their last semester's GPA. We're asking students about if they've considered taking leave, if they have taken leave, if they've switched majors, etc. And because you're already going to be asking about victimization, you can see if there are any correlations there and show things like, okay, survivors at our institution generally have lower GPAs, or survivors at our institution report one of the most frequent impacts of going through sexual violence being a negative impact on their academic work. You can connect the impact of trauma to student retention. You can ask students if they're considering transferring or if they considered transferring after they went through whatever form of victimization you're asking about. You can also connect this to institutional reputation and ask about perceptions of the institution or the institution's response to survivors or of the community. So these are just a few examples, but I think one of the skills that advocates have and one of the major things they can offer the survey process is to bring in their expertise and to be able to make these connections for people. So overall, advocates, they have expertise. You all know these things. You know what assaults look like. You know what survivors go through. And you can bring that to the table regardless of what the survey process is that's going on, whether it's developing a tool, whether it's refining it for use in the future, whether it's figuring out how to interpret data, etc. You have that expertise. The other thing is advocates are a confidential resource, and so being an advocate, working with an advocate has fewer barriers than some of the services offered on campus. So chances are you might be seeing more cases, more survivors, a broader cross-section of survivors than on-campus resources are. So again, that expertise. Lastly, you have that trauma-informed perspective, and this is probably the most tangible of the list of three here, but for example, you can offer to a group who's working on a survey, you can offer your experience working with survivors and let them know that because you've worked with survivors, you have a trauma-informed perspective. And that can mean, anything from thinking about what concepts are covered in the survey all the way to reviewing specific items and incorporating relevant concepts and rewording them to make them survivor-friendly. So a good example of this is As I've been working on our campus climate survey, I've looked through other tools that have been developed since our 2014 survey and seen that a common question on some tools is asking about sexual violence and then asking, were you drinking when this happened? So my advocate self, I might come forward and say, do we really need this? If we really, really need to know this information, how can we reword this so it doesn't tap into ideas of blame or anything close to that? Okay. So now that we've talked about advocates and their role in these processes, I'm going to give you some insight into the processes that we went through here at MIT in developing the survey in 2014 and for use in 2017. And after we get through this section, I'm going to talk about challenges and lessons learned. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about processes both in 2014 and 2017. So you'll see the year is on each respective slide. So this is 2014, and this is committee and stakeholder support. So on the left, you see that list of offices and individuals in colored boxes. That was our working group. It included the chancellor, it included people from my office, violence prevention and response, it included Title IX, and many others. That was our working group. It was pretty large. We also got input and stakeholder feedback from all the groups on the right, so students, support services, etc. So comparing that to 2017, this process, or the process for this time around, we have a much smaller working group that involves people from my office, so violence prevention and response, Title IX, and then one individual from the Chancellor's office who has a background in institutional research. The Chancellor is ultimately in charge of the tool that we develop, and when she's satisfied with the draft we come up with, she'll get it approved by General Counsel. We still have all these stakeholder groups to think about and to be in touch with and make sure their interests are represented on the survey, but it's been a little easier to have a smaller working group. In terms of tool development and the process we went through, in 2014 it was an extremely tight timeline, and I won't get into the details of that, but it was just sort of how the issue arose to the president's, or caught the president's attention on campus, and he ended up charging the chancellor with doing something, and anyway, it ended up being a very short timeline. So our process was sort of starting in the literature and beginning with advocate knowledge, getting student input, doing a bunch of revisions, stakeholder review, more revision, and student testing. And we started this process in February 2014, and the survey was open by the end of April 2014. So this time around, we have a little bit more time. It's a little easier because we're starting with an existing tool and we're just trying to refine it. So it's a pretty similar process. And where we're at right now is we have done the stakeholder input and revision. We've done literature and advocate knowledge and working group meetings. We just got a draft to the chancellor, and I'm actually really excited. We're going to be working with students tomorrow night to go through the entire draft and get feedback, and then keep working on that draft. So, obviously, these processes aren't easy. There are challenges that come along with them, and so I want to highlight a few that I think will be helpful to you, regardless of what stage of the process you're involved with, whether it's thinking of creating a tool, working on revising it, or just being involved with the data and analysis and processing and interpretation. So these are challenges that come with creating a tool. So we have to balance these. So the first one is specificity of data and the length of tools. So we want data that is specific enough to tell us what we want to know, but we also want to make sure that we don't create a super long tool that no one's going to finish. Similarly, we have to balance the importance of various questions with their place in the survey. So as a researcher, as someone who likes to know a lot about whatever the topic is, it was really hard for me to think of, okay, I have to prioritize these questions. I'm interested in all of them, but we know that with surveys, there are people who drop off, and drop-off increases the longer a tool is. So what do we put up front? What do we put towards the end? And then the last one on this slide is balancing the need to know specific things about our campus with the ability to compare to other campuses or other survey tools, data, and results. Another challenge is building consensus. I mentioned earlier on that slide that our working group was huge the first time around, and considering that there are different stakeholders in that group, that they had different agendas, priorities, and goals, it was really challenging to build consensus, as I'm sure you can imagine. So in terms of lessons learned from that process, I would say by far the most important one is planning in advance. So that means knowing the specific questions that you want your survey to answer. It's surprising, I guess, like how often people set out to do a survey and they don't have a short list of questions that they want to answer. Also, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Go to the literature for guidance, look at other tools. Things exist, and you don't have to start from scratch. Getting back to planning in advance, I think it's so important to define the roles in any kind of working group, and relatedly to establish what the decision-making process and structure is right from the beginning. Another tip I think could be extremely helpful, and whenever I've mentioned this to colleagues, they like the idea, is the idea of creating your analysis and dissemination plans before anyone takes the survey. So what I mean by that is once you have, a draft of the survey, being able to create an analysis plan that says, okay, we want to know, sexual victimization rates, and we want to see if there's a difference between international students and non-international students. So your analysis plan would be taking those two variables, so sexual violence experiences by international student identity, and seeing what the difference is there. For dissemination plans, I mean thinking through exactly what is going to be shared with the public and how it's going to be shared. So for example, you can create a template for a results report before you have the results. And that can be extremely helpful because what it forces you to do as a working group is agree on what you're going to share before anyone sees the numbers. It is extremely challenging to get all the data in, have a working group with varying agendas, varying priorities, and agree on what numbers should be shared because people are weighing what should be shared with how the numbers look. One way to get around this is to create a dissemination plan in advance, agree on it, and then just fill it in once you get the data. In addition, so getting back to the idea of planning in advance, having a timeline for every step of the process is incredibly, incredibly helpful. So I did mention before that our working group in 2014 was larger, and the one we have for this time around is much smaller. And I'm not saying smaller is better than bigger. I think whatever size works for your campus or the campus you're working with is totally fine as long as the pieces around knowing your goals, your roles, decision-making structure, and timeline are in place. I think those are so important. So switching gears, I'm going to talk about those tools I mentioned earlier. So the first one is a handout that's a general framework handout, and this is actually something I created based on my own survey experience, mostly in grad school, and it's something that helped me get a good seat at the table for the campus climate survey creation process. So I'm sharing this with you so you can use it to arm yourself with knowledge about the process, about different stages of it, and different things to consider at different stages. So I recommend that you take a look at this before you're even at the table. This is something you can use and sort of tweak to whatever you're working on your specific campus, but it's a good guideline, and it's something that you can come back to throughout the process to make sure you're not missing anything, to make sure you're still working towards the same original goals, and just use to sort of keep everyone on the same page. And again, this is something that really helped me in terms of getting a seat at the table, so I want to share it with you all in case anyone is trying to get a seat at the table or is advocating for a survey to happen on their campus. It's a lengthy document. These are all the names of the sections in the document, and they range from management and logistics to study design to data collection methods. And there's a ton of information under each one, so feel free to look at that handout when Nastia sends it out, and please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have questions, if you're wondering how to apply this framework, how to adapt it. I created these and I'm sharing them with you so that they are helpful to you. So please let me know how I can help you use them. The other handout I created was less for me in the MIT process and more for partners and other people from campuses who are just sort of starting on a climate survey. And this is thinking about selecting members of your team to work on the campus climate survey team. So they include various things, but the first one is, I'll give you as an example, it's called political clout, influence, and power. So this is just getting at the idea that you can have, a group of passionate advocates and frontline people working on developing a survey, but if you don't have someone who has the political power to get the go-ahead to cultivate will on campus, it's not going to go very far. So what I have here is sort of an explanation of what I mean by that general skill area, and then a place where you can write in ideas for who that might be. So for us, it was the chancellor when we thought about political will. So, okay, switching gears for a little bit, I wanted to touch on logic models, etc. I mentioned them on the earlier slide, the one that was super crazy with all the boxes, all the colored boxes everywhere. And I want to mention them because I think they are very valuable tools for figuring out exactly what we're doing to reach our ultimate and our intermediate goals. And just to note, this is larger than climate surveys, but I'm going to talk about how climate surveys can sort of work their way into these and how they can benefit from doing this kind of strategic level work. So, again, apologies for the text, but starting on the right side. So, logic models help us think through steps to reach a goal. Theories of change help us think about what causes certain behaviors, and if we know about the cause, we can think about how to change those behaviors. So, overarching questions that might come up during these processes and be helpful to thinking about how to use a logic model are things like, what causes sexual violence? What are risk and protective factors? Considering that our population is, one group of students at one institution, what can we reasonably attempt to change within that population? And then what do we need to know to attempt to change those things? So this can be related to the survey in a number of ways. So let's say, I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say we think that committing sexual violence is a learned behavior, and we know that there are certain risk factors for committing sexual violence. So first of all, I'd encourage you to think about, can we reasonably change any of those risk factors or the extent to which they exist in the campus community? If so, how might we do that? And then what do we need to know to go about setting such a plan or project in motion? And how will we know if we're successful? So certain parts of this might fit into the survey. So for example, measuring how prevalent a risk factor or an attitude is, testing any assumptions about the project or plan we come up with, and or gathering data to determine if we are successful or not. So for example, we might come up with a program that we think will work over the long term, but when we break it down into steps, we might see that we need students to go through the program, and we might hope to see some attitudinal changes once they go through the program. That is something that can be measured on a campus climate survey and would be better done on a tool distributed to all students, or at least more than just those who go through the program, so you end up with data from those who did go through the program and those who did not. And if you're asking everyone the same attitude-based question, so like an agree, disagree, rate, miss question, you'll be able to parse that out and say, well, we can't say it's causal, but we know that those who go through the program agree with this rate miss less, right? And so that can give you an indication that maybe something is working, or at least there's something worth exploring there. So this is from the CDC Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence Prevention Programs Evaluation Guide, which is a document I use often, primarily because I'm personally interested in evaluation and research, but I think this model can be really helpful. So thinking about logic models, really they help us answer big picture questions. And a logic model essentially is a series of big picture questions just rearranged. So ignore the boxes on the bottom, just focus on the top row. And start here. Number one, what is your goal? Okay, our goal might be to ultimately end sexual violence, or it might be something else that's more intermediate. What is your theory about the causes of the thing you want to change? What specifically do you hope to change, and what program activities or initiatives or whatever it is will result in the desired changes? So thinking through these questions in this order, I think, can be helpful because they're kind of in a logical order. And all you have to do is rearrange them and you get a logic model. So I'll show you on the next page. So you just rearrange it. You have number 2 here. What's your theory about the cause of violence or whatever the thing is you're trying to change? What program activities will result in the desired changes? What do you hope will be the outcomes of going through that program? And then how will those outcomes eventually lead to your goal? And again, this is just a tool to think through big picture, general mapping type stuff, and then components of that can be worked into your campus climate survey. So I want to show you this. This is just my resources and reference page, and I apologize, the text is a little big, so it's falling off the page, but we can make sure that you all get a PDF of the slides so you have everything. But I just wanted to point out that I have stuff here that is from our 2014 survey. So we have the tool, we have the FAQ, we have the results, we have communication to the community, we have a report by the task force. I also included stuff on logic models, and I know I talked about them for 2 slides, but they can be very helpful tools, and there's a lot more information available out there. So I ran through that pretty quickly. I hope it was clear, but I'm excited to hear what questions people have, if there are any.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for such an illuminating presentation. I've been scribbling myself. I did want to start off with one question, thinking about kind of timeline and incentives. So when do you think is the best time to be starting the development process? Obviously, considering that there might be different amounts of stakeholders at the table, the development process might be of different lengths, but when do you find is the best time to distribute a campus climate survey to the students? And also, what incentives have you seen that are productive to make sure that you're getting a good sample population responding to the survey? And while Kelly is answering this, if folks want to type in questions to the chat box, then we can get to them as well.
Those are great questions. So in terms of starting the process of developing a tool, I think the earlier the better, because it'll always take longer than you think it will, is what I've learned. And in terms of when a good time is to distribute the survey, I think it depends on your campus's calendar. So I'll give you an example. So here, MIT students are over-surveyed. So whenever we want to do any kind of survey, there's always pushback because they get so many surveys. And so what we decided on ultimately after talking through our options with that big working group was to do it in April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So we have a lot going on campus, raising awareness about the issue of sexual assault. So that sort of helps promote the issue, bring attention to it. And then when we put out the call for students to fill out the survey, it sort of seems to be in line with what's already going on in the month. This is a challenging time because it's near the end of classes. So I would say in that regard, it's not ideal. But we figured out, based on all the other surveys that are happening and based on activities happening on campus, it made the most sense for us to do it in April. In terms of incentives, in 2014, so I'm sure most campuses have this. We have something called Tech Cash, which is really just like money that you can only use on campus. And our incentive was $10 in Tech Cash for anyone who completed the survey. And when they got to the end of it, they were taken to a separate web page to ensure confidentiality. And on that separate web page, so it wasn't connected to their survey answers at all, on that separate page, it asked them to enter in their email address if they wanted to get $10 in Tech Cash. The other choice was to donate $10 to either my office, which provides advocacy services to survivors, or to another group on campus, a student group that works to end sexual assault, or to just not take the incentive and not donate it. And I know at least 40% of the students who took the survey decided to donate the $10, which was really nice. But I also know, I just wanted to mention, I know I'm trying to think, I think it was University of Michigan, they did a survey. They actually did two surveys, but the one that they developed in-house, they did on campus, and they had some sort of incentive, and they increased the monetary value of the incentive as the close of the survey was getting closer and closer. And I remember learning from them that that actually didn't increase participation. So the amount of the incentive is not necessarily directly tied to whether people will participate or not. And one thing that they found was they had a few different methods for getting people to participate, and I apologize, I don't know all the details of this, but I know one of the things they did that helped them get a better response rate from groups that were typically like groups that had low response rates was they sent students out on campus with iPads and had people take the survey in person. And obviously there's issues to be considered with that tactic, so things like privacy, things like feeling hurried to complete it, all of that, but it ended up working for them. So I think it's incentives, but I think it's also thinking creatively about how you can get people to participate.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. We have another question asking what some of the more surprising outcomes were that you found from the results in the 2014 survey.
That's a good question. Let's see. So we did find, there's several of them that are popping into my head, but I'll give you one example. So the survey team put out results in 2014 and put out a number that they labeled sexual assault through incapacitation, threats, or force. And the number for that for undergraduate women who had experienced that while at MIT was, I believe it was 17% or so, and that was sort of the big number that was put out there. We had some very thoughtful student activists and educators who said, wait a minute, isn't sexual assault more than just incapacitation and force and threats, like especially compared to MIT's policy? And so later in 2015, another set of results was released, and the category used to label those results was unwanted sexual behavior. And from my perspective as an advocate, and considering what the MIT policy is, I would say that's just all of sexual assault. But the number for that category for undergraduate women while at MIT was 32%. So the difference between sexual assault through incapacitation, force, and threats and looking at a comprehensive definition of sexual assault made a huge difference. The other thing, one other thing that came out of that I was surprised by, but it sort of made sense because it lined up with the literature, was a third of those who indicated they had experienced sexual assault at MIT had never told anyone before indicating it on the survey. And so that was really special to me as an advocate, because what it told me was we at least have a small group of people who felt comfortable enough with the way this survey was written to share that information that they hadn't shared with anyone else.
Wow, yeah, thank you so much. A third is higher than I would have expected given population sample and such. So kind of bouncing off that, we have a question asking about survey fatigue. So with students being over-surveyed becoming an increasing problem on so many campuses, what are your thoughts and strategies relating to population versus sample surveys?
That's a good question. So in 2014, we did a census survey, which means we sent it out to every single enrolled grad and undergrad student. People have different opinions on which method is better, and I know, again, my colleague at University of Michigan told me she really prefers sort of a random sample, and there are pros and cons to both. In terms of combating survey fatigue, I think it's cultivating interest in the topic of the survey and sending messages about the importance of it. I also think it's coordinating with other people who are doing surveys. So there's only so much you can do about survey fatigue, but you can try to manage it by not having, several surveys open at the same time, by not, continually surveying one group over and over in the course of like a year or a semester. So I think it's a combination of interest in the topic area. It's also about accessibility, and what I mean by that is thinking about, okay, if this survey is online and I can only take it on my computer, that's going to lessen accessibility for me, because I might be more willing to take it if I can do it on my phone while I'm on the T or while I'm on the way to class or whatever. And similarly, other decisions like that in terms of, can you start it and then finish it later, or do I have to sit down and do the whole thing right now? So there's sort of options about survey design that you can pursue and try and lessen the effects of survey fatigue, but there's also options at like the higher, more, I guess, like institutional level in terms of when you survey.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Sure.
Another question on kind of implementing changes after the survey data has been distributed or publicized, or like whichever answers the office does choose to make public with the students. As somebody who works at kind of in an advocacy role at a violence response kind of aspect of the school, how did you coordinate with the Title IX office to change programming in response to survey results?
That's a really good question. So because this was done so publicly, and what I mean by that is basically what happened in the very beginning of 2014 was we had an alum share her story anonymously with the MIT Tech, the student newspaper, and for whatever reason, our new president saw the article and felt the need to respond to the entire community saying, I know you saw this in the paper, it is unacceptable, this is not what we stand for here at MIT, and to prove this, I'm going to charge our brand new chancellor, who's a transportation engineer, by the way, with the issue of sexual assault and figuring it out on campus. So it was a very public call to action, an assignment of responsibility, and a due date, because he said, I want to report by the end of the semester. And because it was so public, that helped create accountability. And so there was this, like, what are we going to do once we get the data? And the decision was to create a task force. So I think it was called something like the Sexual Misconduct and Education and Prevention, or I can't remember the exact name, but task force. And the two people who chaired it were my boss, so the Director of Violence Prevention and Response, and the Title IX coordinator. So they were forced to work together, and they brought in other stakeholders in the community to create a larger task force to figure out exactly what they were going to do with the survey results. And because that task force was announced publicly on campus, they were sort of on the hook for a list of recommendations and a report at the end of it. So we have that document. I have a link to it in the slides. So I think it's that. I think it's working. It's figuring out exactly what you're going to do with it and how you're going to figure that out. And I will say that one huge thing that came out of doing the survey and getting the results that we did was there was so much urgency coming from the administration of like, okay, we need to do this and we need to do that other thing and we need to make this mandatory. And one thing my boss very smartly said was, that's a lot of work, and if you want us to do all that work, we need more manpower. And so ultimately, we went from an office of 2.5 FTEs to 6.5 FTEs in order to do all the work that was being put forth.
Awesome, thank you. We have another question asking whether you were concerned that students with prior experience of sexual violence would be more likely to fill out the survey and kind of more drawn to it and therefore be overrepresented, and what measures you take to address that.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's not something that we looked into here. There's a lot of pieces to sort of our survey process here, but I know that there is a paper out there by Jennifer Fried, who is a psychologist, I believe, at Oregon, And she wrote a paper on exactly that and methods she used to determine that, in fact, there wasn't an oversampling of survivors. So we didn't engage in that kind of analysis here, but I know it's been done, and I would recommend that paper for some guidance.
Okay, thanks. I can send that out with the follow-up materials as well. Another question, Kelly. Some of the schools that some programs in New York State and probably some who are on this webinar are working with are not as excited to be making proactive changes on their campus as it seems your administration was. Do you have any tips or strategies to kind of argue your way into the door and to help advocate for a trauma-informed and an intentional, thorough campus climate survey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that part about figuring out what the interests are and connecting doing a survey with those interests. So if the attitude is sort of, we don't want to make public that we have a problem here or that we could discover a problem, you could approach that as like, great, like let's just make sure we're doing as good of a job as we think we are. Or if the idea is something like, I don't know, it would help to get details in terms of what the resistance is, but if the attitude is that everything is working as it should be working, then you can use the climate survey to show that in fact it is and to just demonstrate compliance. So that's a route that I am less interested in because I'm an advocate and I'm more interested in change and what experiences are like for survivors and making sure our services are the best they can be. But if someone's resistant to that, you can use it as a tool to confirm what we think we already know. And then the other thing is going back to those overarching goals. If people are worried about the reputation of the institution, about, I don't know, student retention, like make the connection between sexual violence and those goals clear and talk about how they influence each other and how addressing sexual violence can actually help us achieve those goals of student retention or whatever the priority is.
Thank you so much. Last few moments, so if folks still have questions, do send them in. We have another one asking about what your response rate was for the 2014 survey and how it compared to other surveys that y'all had distributed.
I know that I think overall our response rate was 35%, which doesn't sound that great, but it's actually pretty good for a survey. And it ranged, like I think undergraduate women had like a 40% response rate, and then we know that for every survey we do at MIT, graduate males are the least likely to respond, so that was a little lower than 35%. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how it compared to other campuses' climate survey response rates. For example, I know that Harvard's, I think, was like upwards, somewhere around 50%, which was really, really good. And one of the things that they did on campus was Conan O'Brien is a Harvard alum, so he offered to do a video addressing students saying, this is important, please take the survey. So things like that. But if you're interested in specifics in terms of response rates to that survey versus other MIT surveys, I can definitely look that up. So if whoever asked that question wants to follow up with me, I'd be happy to figure that out for you.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, Kelly, about IRB, Institutional Review Board approval. Is that necessary for campus climate surveys or not as much? Or?
Yeah, so my suggestion is to always go through the IRB. For this, we went through the IRB and it was deemed exempt, so we could go through a really quick review. And the reason for that is we weren't publishing anything, we were just using it for sort of improvement of our own, educational programs, and that's why it was given exempt status. But I would say always go through the IRB. They're a great partner to start talking to once you're even thinking about doing a campus climate survey, because they can help you with the steps you need to think through and deadlines and all that kind of stuff. And they're a great partner to have on your side sort of anyway. So.
Great, thank you so much. And we have another question asking if you're able to share the results of the 2014 survey or if they're accessible somewhere online.
Absolutely. So links to both sets of results, the ones from 2014 and 2015, those links are on that resources slide.
Okay. Great, thank you. And another question coming in about how often you would advise doing the campus climate survey. So there are certain mandates in Enough is Enough legislation for New York State, but do you find that if you've done kind of a full extensive campus climate survey in 1 year, that do you try and do a different approach or target a different population the next year, or do you kind of do the whole to do every year?
No, I saw that in the legislation that it's recommending every other year. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that seems really often to me. So I think you could be creative with how you target it. I think you could do the whole thing every year. I think you could you could alternate, I guess. Like, let's say you're interested in collecting information on sexual violence, dating and domestic violence, stalking and harassment. Maybe 1 year you do sexual violence and stalking, and the next year you do the same survey but focused on dating and domestic violence and harassment or something. I think there's an opportunity to be creative there, but I think it's also based on what your working group wants. They may want that data collected more often. I don't know.
Okay, thank you so much, Kelly. I think we've gone through all the questions at the moment. Do you have any last thoughts before I quickly wrap it up?
I think just that it can seem really daunting, especially if you don't have any experience working with surveys or with survey data, but just remember that you play an incredibly important role in conceptualizing it, in making meaning of it, and just because you don't have the technical expertise doesn't mean that the skills you do have are unimportant. I think they're incredibly important. And again, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm happy to talk with you individually to sort of figure out what's going on with the campus you're working with, or be of service however I can.
Thank you so much, Kelly. This was very informative, and we're very lucky to have you present to us. So just to confirm, I will be sending out the PowerPoint, which does have the resources page on it, as well as the recording of the webinar, the PDFs that Kelly mentioned, and I'll track down the piece of research by Jennifer Fry as well to include that with the follow-up email. Reminder, if you have any training or technical assistance requests for your program, please feel free to contact us at either the New York City Alliance or at NSCASA. We're always happy to help. We can definitely talk through campus climate surveys that you're working on, or even identify the stakeholders at the school that you're working with, or trying to find the best argument to advocate for the fact that you should be part of this process if the school that you're working with is starting to develop a campus climate survey in response to Enough is Enough mandates. And we'll also be sharing best practices through our listserv and upcoming technical assistance website. So again, thank you so much. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you everybody for joining us. And hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye, everybody.